welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens and this is English Nerd. Today I was thinking about talking to you about point of view. Now whether you're writing an essay or especially a piece of fiction, even a manual, point of view is really important. So first of all, what is point of view? There are three basic points of view. There's first person. So I went to the store, we did this. Second person, which really is only used for commands and choose your own adventure stories. So you enter the submarine, what are you gonna do? So using you instead. And then third person, which is really popular, he, she, it, they. I and you really don't come into third person, it's everything else. So what is so important and interesting about these points of view? Well, I'm going to go through each one really quickly and tell you some of the pros and cons of using that point of view. And if you're kind of on the fence about what to use as you're writing, hopefully this will clear those things up. So first of all, first person. There are a lot of pros to first person. It's really popular for young adult fiction, for instance, because some of the pros of using first person are immediate relatability. Automatically, people can put themselves in the shoes of the protagonist or even of the person who's arguing. If you say, I believe this, I crouched behind the rock waiting to see what would happen. Immediately, there's this kind of almost visceral connection to the narrator of your piece. And so that is a definite pro. First person has a lot of perks in that regard. You don't have to work as hard to get people to connect with your narrator. Now there are a couple of cons though. The first con is that you can't see from any other person's perspective. And so that can be a good thing. If, for instance, you're writing a mystery and you don't want the reader to know what's going on in the heads of other people, maybe first person is the way to go for you. The second downside of first person is that if you're writing, say, a thriller piece, you can't kill the character off. I've heard that there are ways to get around this, but all of them sound pretty clunky and frankly a little bit dumb to me. If you're writing in first person, the assumption is that you have lived through, or your protagonist or whatever has lived through this experience and is relating to us what happened in that person's past. If the protagonist dies, where are they writing from? Are they writing from heaven? Or was the whole thing just a letter? That's another way people get around it. But generally speaking, it does using first person simultaneously ups the tension and in some ways decreases it as well. So those are some pros and cons of first person. One more thing about first person that's really cool that you can do is use unreliable narrators. So this is kind of a higher level writing and even analyzing term for literature and just books in general. If you use first person, then you are automatically going through a biased lens. You're writing through a biased lens, whether that lens is your own opinion, just as the writer as you're writing this essay, or the opinion of the protagonist. So an unreliable narrator means that just what you think it means. This is not just the story as it happened. There's some room there for perception, for the person's individual lies or even madness to create a filter between you and the story. So you can't always trust what a first person narrator says. If you're looking for a completely straightforward, trustworthy story, maybe first person isn't the way to go. But if you want to add that element of what's real and what's not, then first person might be a great choice. If you want to see one story that does this really well, there are plenty that I could choose from, but check out The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It's written in diary entry form, so of course it's in first person, but it is fascinating to try to read between the lines and figure out what's actually happening because our narrator is so unreliable. So that's first person. Second person, really you shouldn't use second person. Again, that's you, this. Unless you're writing some kind of how-to manual, you're giving commands, things like that. There are a couple pieces of literature where I've seen the occasional use of second person being used really well, but I would generally advise against it, both in academic and in fiction writing. Just if you want to see how it could be used in fiction effectively, sparingly but effectively, you can check out One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He occasionally will use commands or say, it's just like this is happening to you, to draw in the audience so that they really feel like they are also in that labor camp with Ivan Denisovich in that little book. Really, you should read that in general. It's super good. As a rule, I don't use second person either for fiction or nonfiction because it usually comes across as really sloppy and immature. So unless you're Solzhenitsyn, I would say tread with caution or proceed with caution. Third person is the last one. Third person is generally what people use for academic writing. I've seen first person used as well, but if you are new to academic writing, I would say try writing without first person first. People often will use it as a crutch. They'll say things like, I believe XYZ. Now, of course, if you're making the argument XYZ, that is what you believe. That is how you think the story should be interpreted or the problem should be solved. There's really no need for that I believe statement. I know that some assignments call for first person. Bring in your own personal experience. Bring in your own opinions and make it clear that they're your own. If that's the case, then of course go for it. Use first person. If there is no such specification, though, I would very much lean toward third person for academic writing for some of the reasons that we've already said. Without that first person lens, your writing appears to be less biased, and the I believe is already understood. You don't want to use those statements as a crutch. Can you make the argument without saying I or we? If so, then chances are you know your material better, as strange as that sounds. So third person generally should be used for academic writing unless you are C.S. Lewis or something like that, or your assignment specifically says otherwise. Third person is a lot more dynamic than people think it is. Again, that's he, she, it, they. It's writing without the filter of I or you. There are multiple ways to use third person. Going back to fiction, the two main differences in third person types of narration are third person limited, which is writing only from the perspective of one character and seeing just what's in their heads. This is actually what I prefer, third person limited, because it allows you to get close to a character, to really get under their skin without having some of the limitations that first person narration offers. So a great example of this would be the Harry Potter series. Even though we have this huge cast of characters that are also wonderful, the only person that we really follow the entire time is Harry. It's not written in first person, it's written in third, but he is the one through whom we understand the entire story. His thoughts are the only ones that we get to read. We don't get Hermione's, we don't get Ron's, we only understand them through Harry's perception of them. So third person limited is a great way to have the kind of closeness that approximates first person while still having that tension that the character could be killed off and you don't know what the others are thinking. The second kind of third person narration that is popular is third person omniscient. This is not as popular now as it used to be in, say, the 1800s when people like Jane Austen were writing. Third person omniscient means that not only do you see into the mind of one character, but you can kind of come in and out and see from the perspective of a variety of different characters, sometimes all in the same scene. There are some pros to this. Sometimes it's good to get that ensemble feeling, really understanding where everyone's coming from. Personally, I think that it's a little harder to connect with. In fact, that's why I have a hard time just jiving with Jane Austen's style of writing. Even though I love Pride and Prejudice, the story, her writing style doesn't allow me to get into the skin of her characters in the same way that other writers are able to do. So that's pretty much it. Some point of view. You have first person, second person, third person, but there's a lot more to consider than it initially seems. It's not just should I use I, you, or he. It's how do you want the reader's experience to be? How much tension do I want to create? Do I want my narrator to be reliable or not? So much fun stuff to consider. So hopefully this cleared things up for you. I really get excited about this topic. I know it sounds boring, but hopefully I've proved to you that that's not the case and you have some clarity with your own writing. If you would like some more writing tips and just other English nerd goodness, make sure to subscribe below. Write in the comments any questions that you might have. I'd be happy to answer those, and I will see you next Monday.